Hello, everybody. Are you ready to begin Chapter 2? This is our chapter on the research methods of social psychology. If you've had Introduction to Sociology or Introduction to Psychology, you've had quite a bit of this material before, so it should make it an easier chapter. But that being said, of course it has new material. I think it would be boring otherwise. So let's begin. It's now time to turn our attention to our favorite research method, but don't tell the other researchers' methods that we have a favorite. The experiment is our favorite because it's the only one that can determine cause and effect. So we can say this thing, that causes that thing in the real world to happen. So let's review the major components of the experiment. Hopefully from one of your previous courses, you talked about two groups and two variables. See if you can remember the names. Give it a try. So for the groups, it would be the experimental and control group. Be careful. On a test, if you put experimental and controlled, I would mark you wrong because that's not only a spelling error, it's a conceptual error. If you say controlled, it sounds like the group that's being controlled. Couldn't be furthest for the case. It gives control. It gives us knowledge. So it's got to be, to reiterate, experimental and control group. The variables, independent and dependent. How did you do? Let's tackle the variables. In the experiment, we have the independent video as well as the audio variable is the treatment. Click both. It means subjects get it. Some do not add on to the video after I pause it. And I often do that when I'm recording the audio. Does not. So I hope I didn't get your head spinning too much. You're thinking between the group that gets it, what we find when we run the experiment, versus the dependent variable. They are the, again, control. We choose the dependent variable when we set up the experiment. Is the outcome that very specific outcome once we run the experiment. Until we run the experiment. Some students tend to flip it, and I can remember a big confusion way back when also. If I ask you the dependent variable. I teach it this way. The dependent variable is I might say this particular study technique because it's the outcome. I would predict it will enhance maybe student the outcome depends on everything that goes on in your experiment. That would be my prediction. Including but if I ask you the subject would be on it, do they get the treatment or not? So the treatment variable effect. So it would be since the student test performance is dependent. It wouldn't be enhanced goes on the study test performance or worsen test performance dependent or variable. No change in test performance. Hopefully that makes sense. So the dependent variable. If your teacher in intro psych taught it set out to make sense, well then stay with that way. Now the experiment shown on the right is the very famous Darley and Batson Good-Samaritan experiment study. Interestingly, found out that a major variable that determines whether not people that actually occurs is when you run the experiment how time rushed they are. For example, in the example study, this cell phone, they were given urgency. Our hypothesis was from one brain to the other. The presence of cell phone other subjects cause given no urgency conversations who are not given the urgency or so in a test you can't say to help. For the dependent variable, I can remember one time in college playing a game with friends, and one of the questions was, if you're on the way to a job interview. Now I remember because I was horrified his answer. Something we still is a good friend. Before we run it, if you're on the way to a very important job outcome and you see a blind person with visually impaired person are lost variable when they're walking, and hopefully that works for you. And thank you for ignoring the cell phone. My friend said no. If it was a very important job interview, not unless it was life or death. I was horrified. I would put myself in the place of that person, and I would hope that anybody would stop to help me. So, the very famous Darley and Batson experiment found the very important variable of how time rushed the person is. Before we're ready to apply our terms, we have learned the other set of terms, the groups. Experimental group. There's the subjects who get the treatment, whatever that treatment might be. It might be medication. It might be a new study technique. It might be exercise. You get the idea. It's a treatment. So if they're getting the treatment, they are the experimental group. The control group, well, that would be the subjects who do not get the treatment. They're treated alike in every other way, so if the experimental group gets a pill, the control group gets a placebo pill, and so on. So we need the control group for comparison. What would happen if the people didn't, or the animals didn't get the treatment? So in psychology, there's haves and have-nots. Sometimes it's better to be in the have-not group, sometimes it's better to be in the have group. But now let's apply this and see how we do. So next, please, consider the critical thinking question. And after you have time to ponder it, click the next image for the listening link, please. We certainly wouldn't want to assign people to groups based on first come versus latter come. Perhaps the people that show up early are all type A's. Maybe they are a little bit overly into other people's perceptions of them, what have you. But if we divide them in this basis, now we've got two different things going on. Our experimental group get the treatment, and they're the first comes perhaps. And maybe the control group, they get no treatment, but they're also different because they're the latter arrivals, or vice versa. So we can't have two different sets of things going on. We only have to have one thing different between the groups, and that's got to be our treatment, or lack thereof. The picture on the right is from Michelle's very famous marshmallow study on the delay of gratification. So the children were put into a minor quandary, sat down in front of one highly desirable marshmallow and told, you can eat it right now, but if you will wait a few minutes, you will be given two. So does the child who loves marshmallows eat it immediately, or are they able to delay their gratification? The attached link I think you'll find very enjoyable. But Michelle, down the road, looked at students' performance on other measures, including SAT scores, and the students who were able to delay their gratification actually had higher SAT scores, so associated with higher academic performance. So now that you've heard this brief summary, go ahead and visit the link. So now let's learn our terminology, which is specific to the experiment, starting with variables. The independent variable, IV if you want to abbreviate it, is the treatment. Next time you get a prescription, if it's a paper one, look on it and you'll see an RX. That's the abbreviation for treatment. So it might be medication. It might be a new study technique. It might be a new form of exercise. So it's a treatment. And we'll learn that half the subjects will get it and half will not. But in any case, the independent variable is the treatment. The dependent variable is the measured outcome. As a mnemonic, which might help you out so you don't confuse the two, the outcome is dependent. The outcome is dependent on everything that goes on in the study, which group you're in, if you get the treatment or not, if the treatment works. So the outcome is dependent, so it is called the dependent variable. Now, caution here, on your first test, you'll probably have two different hypotheses, and for each one, you'll have to also design an experiment indicating the variables in the groups. When you choose your dependent variable, don't confuse it with the results of the study that you run. For example, if we were going to look at maybe the effects of exercise on weight, for the dependent variable, it would be weight. You wouldn't put weight loss because you don't know until you run the study if there will be weight loss. You choose a dependent variable before the study is run. If you're looking at insomnia, your dependent wouldn't be a reduction in insomnia. The dependent variable would just be a quality of sleep. So again, dependent variable is the outcome, and we establish the outcome measure before we run the study. And if I lost you there, it's okay. We're going to practice it on the next couple slides. I hope you understand the redundancy that I build in on the harder concepts. It is intentional. Let's consider this example. I'm going to ask you to create a possible hypothesis, identify the variables, and identify the groups. So go ahead and do that, and we'll see how you do. So when creating your possible hypothesis, I hope your hypothesis was a statement, and it was specific, not mood has an effect on students' prosocial behaviors. You should predict it. Good mood will enhance prosocial behaviors. Good or worse mood will decrease prosocial behaviors. So it has to be not only a statement, but very specific. If you've done that, you've probably got a very good hypothesis. Variables. So the independent variable is the treatment, dependent variable, the outcome, which depends on it. So the treatment is mood condition. whether they were placed into a good or bad mood. So perhaps manipulation of mood would be a great way to phrase it. The outcome, you can say rate of prosocial behaviors, whether or not they engage in helping or prosocial behaviors. Don't say increased prosocial behaviors, don't say decrease, because again, we don't know that until the study is run. And the groups, experimental, those who had their mood enhanced, those who had their mood altered, control group, those whose mood was left alone, those whose mood was not manipulated. On this slide, we'll learn about the two types of validity. When you get to internal validity, sorry about that, you'll notice a blank. Decide whether it should be filled in with independent or dependent variable. After that, we'll go to consider the Loftus and Palmer very famous experiment on memory and the manipulation of it. So the treatment is the independent variable. Now let's consider this very famous experiment. Students were shown a videotape of a minor car accident. Later on, they heard a narration or read a narration that asked them questions, and the questions used different phrasing, either when the cars hit each other or the cars smashed each other. And students were asked as the measured outcome, the dependent variable, to guess how fast the cars were going based on the video they saw. And we learned how fragile memory is. Students who were in the condition who read or heard the word smashed estimated the cars were going quite a bit more fast than if they were exposed to the word hit. So memory was actually being altered depending on phrasing that occurred after they saw the video. Very interesting, yes? Let's now consider the three base experiment types: laboratory or laboratory if you prefer, natural or naturalistic, and field. Now the laboratory, or in other words, lab experiment, obviously is connected in the lab, hence its name, easy to control, so high internal validity. But the trade-off is less applicable to the real world, so low external validity. Next, let's consider the natural, or sometimes called naturalistic experiment, is conducted in the real world. It takes advantage of a naturally occurring change. Maybe internet is introduced into the area for the first time, maybe pre-K care, maybe COVID. So some change is occurring and the experimenter is not in control of it. The experimenter might have had access to the data before the change, and it will probably be measuring the population after the change, but they are not in charge of the change. It has no control, so very low internal validity, but since it is occurring in the real world, it has very high external validity. Now let's consider lastly the field experiment. And caution you, some students get the term field and natural or naturalistic mixed up. The field experiment is an experiment that's being conducted in the field. It is basically the laboratory experiment moved to a natural setting. So, and usually the subjects are not aware that they are in the study necessarily. It's middle in terms of control, so intermediate internal validity, and very applicable to the real world, so high in external validity. So there you go. So let's see how comfortable you are with these types of experiments. I did everything I could do to avoid the words laboratory or lab, so this would be definitely a lab experiment. Identify the next one, what type they are. You'll see that the researchers are actually when you click just taking advantage of a naturally occurring change in the world. They're not doing any manipulations. So this would be taking advantage of, you might say, I don't know, the nature of the world or Mother Nature, but anyway, as a mnemonic, but the natural or naturalistic. In example C, well, they are going and doing their study, but they're doing their study Instead of in their laboratory, they're conducting it in the real world. So they've taken it out to the field. So that would be an example of a field study. So these are harder, and you will probably have to spend more time to learn these concepts, but plan on seeing probably a couple different questions on the test. So make sure you're comfortable with these concepts, and all will be good. Statistical significance and perhaps cognitive dissonance are the two most difficult concepts that we'll try to cover in class. You might have to read this slide several times. You might also have to look at how your textbook phrases it. And you can see I have two links also designed to help you learn the concept. So if you're finding it difficult, it's not you, it's the concept. And you'll definitely get more of it when you take definitely experimental psych and definitely statistics as well if you go on to take these two courses. Before we look at specific research methods, we should introduce ourselves to the ethical guidelines that we must follow when doing experiments. Let's start with IRB. This is an acronym that you absolutely positively should know. It stands for Institutional Review Board. And yet when I ask it on test, I get all sorts of different words for I, international, internal, and so on. You know, every college and every research facility has an IRB. SCCC has an IRB. I was actually 50% of it back in the day. Albany has an IRB. Siena has an IRB. St. Rose has an IRB. So think of the different colleges around us, including ourselves. Institutional Review Board. They must approve of psychological research before it's conducted. So they'll look at the proposal. Maybe they'll ask it for it to be changed. Maybe they'll think it's good as it is. Or maybe they'll outright reject it. Now let's look at informed consent. It's got three components. One is we must tell you what we can about the experiment. It might not be a whole lot, but we must inform you about the details of the experiment. Second step, you must be told that you have the right to decline. You have the right to refuse to participate. Rather like marriage in our culture, just because you're asked, you do not have to say yes. The third one, even in the middle experiment, you can change your mind. You can withdraw, which is also rather like marriage in our culture. So you must be informed about as much as we can about what will happen in the experiment. You must be told that you have the right to refuse to participate. And you must be told that you have the right to quit, to withdraw, even after the experiment has begun. If you agree to all that and sign your name on the dotted line, not only do we have your consent, but we have your informed consent. You were informed, and then you consented. It's rather like medical informed consent. They tell you every possible bad thing that could happen. You still want the surgery? Go ahead, sign on the dotted line. They too have your informed consent. Let's consider the topic of deception and debriefing. Can modern-day psychology experiments use deception? Many of my students are quite surprised. Yes, indeed, deception is allowable. A placebo pill is deception. The control group is deception. So yes, deception is allowed. You must convince the IRB that it's necessary. Now, if you deceive, you must follow that with debriefing. Debriefing means that you tell the people in the experiment the deception was used and why you thought it to be necessary. So again, deception is permissible, and debriefing must occur. Next one, confidentiality. If you know what that word means in any context, it's the same here. So we're not allowed to share that you were in the experiment. We're not allowed to share what we found about you. You'll be subject A, subject 972, or so on. So it'd be like calling for your doctor and asking, is so-and-so a patient? Is so-and-so being treated for whatever condition? They are not allowed to say confidentiality. What are some good synonyms? Well, maybe private, anonymous comes close. Last one, protection from harm. Psychologists are obligated to protect their human subjects from harm. That protection from harm includes physical as well as psychological harm. So you should not be physically scarred or mentally scarred from being in a psychology experiment. So those are some of the most basic ethical guidelines that researchers are obligated to follow. Please use the slide to assess your knowledge of hypotheses, groups, and variables. You will need this knowledge for all 4 tests of this particular course. So for number 1, perhaps you hypothesize that high levels of body or brain caffeine would be associated with greater morality in decision making. If you chose that particular hypothesis, for number 2, you'd have to put independent and dependent variable. The independent variable would be the level of caffeine subjects are given. The dependent variable would be the degree of morality in their decision making. The groups would be experimental and control group. The experimental group would be the subjects given caffeine. The control group would be the subjects not given caffeine. For number 4, perhaps your hypothesis was subjects given the drug created by aloxicam will have decreased social anxiety levels. If that was your hypothesis, then number 5, you would identify independent and dependent variable. Independent variables of treatment, so it would be the drug. The dependent variable would be social anxiety levels. For number 6, you identify the groups, experimental group and control group. Experimental group would be the subjects that were given the drug. Control group would be the subjects who were not given the drug. Just as a small point that would affect your grade on a test, make sure when you're doing the dependent variable that you don't say the results of the experiment. So in this one, the dependent variable would be social anxiety levels. You can't say increase social anxiety levels. You can't say decrease social anxiety levels. We only know that after we run the experiment. The dependent variable is determined when the experiment is designed. For number 7, our last question of the chapter, you're going to construct a hypothesis. Perhaps you hypothesize that sleep deprivation will be associated with lowered student academic success. Or perhaps you put a specific number. Students that are sleep deprived, sleeping less than 7 hours per night, will have decreased academic success. And actually quite a bit of research does associate declined functioning, including academic levels, with sleep deprivation. If you're curious about morality and caffeine, I didn't pick that out of a hat. People that are caffeinated actually make more moral decisions. If you look at the time of day in moral decision making, people make their best moral decisions in the morning when they're the most caffeinated. So if you're doing business, perhaps morning is better than the afternoon. For this slide, let's make sure that you understand the 3 basic types of experiments. So read each type and decide, is it laboratory, natural or naturalistic in other words, or field. Now this might be easy because we've had similar slides, but make sure you know the content for the test and for your future courses, including perhaps statistics and our experimental methods course. For our first example, definitely an example of a laboratory experiment. Next one being conducted in other words, a natural setting, a natural or naturalistic experiment. The one on the bottom, well, definitely a true experiment, but just conducted not in a laboratory, but conducted out in the field. So it's a field experiment.